The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, gracious Father, we give you thanks again, as we say every week, for the Lord's Day, for the Sabbath, a day for rest and for recreation, remembering your mighty acts for our salvation. Give us your Spirit here now as we talk about religion, cults, and knowing the difference among them. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Cult used to be a good word. Today it's a word used very carefully. Sociologists, psychologists, psychiatrists even, stumble among themselves in animated disagreement, as I've said, about the issues of cults and whether one can use that word cult or not. The bottom line is the fact that the word was used in the 70s and 80s in a way that is somewhat pejorative, and therefore tends, when you say cult, automatically to be pejorative about the order, which is not necessarily the intent of the word. It is a way of classifying certain groups. In the late 1970s, an organization was formed in response to the terrible disaster at Jonestown, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But in response to that massacre at Jonestown, a murder, suicide, massacre, it goes by whatever terminology one would wish, the daughter of the Congressman Leo Ryan, who was killed in an ambush at Jonestown, formed a group called the Christian Freedom Society. It later morphed rather quickly into the Cult Awareness Network. And the Cult Awareness Network was a response to the increasing popularity in the 70s and 80s about cults and cultic kind of development. The Cult Awareness Network began to be a reference. If you could go on the internet and check cult awareness, they would tell you those individual groups that were designated as cults. Now, there were a lot of people there that would surprise you. Even the Lutherans were designated as cults by some. And of course, what happens when you do that kind of thing, as you begin to find the fox in every woodpile you look at, so that there was a great determination of those groups and people who were cultic. In fact, they began to be something of a cult themselves. As a result of their active, aggressive work, in fact, one of my dear friends, Pastor Dowhauer of All Saints in Bowie, became a regional representative of the Cults Network, Cult Awareness Network, and he was in fact very actively involved in helping people whose families or children or who themselves were involved in cultic associations. But one of the things that began to be popular in this addressing of things that were cultic was a process known as deprogramming. How many have heard the phrase deprogramming? We hear it often, not just about cults, but about gays and lesbians and all that kind of thing. And there were specialists that could be contacted through the Cult Awareness Network who were deprogrammers. Now, often you would go to somebody who was involved in one of these cults and you would try to deprogram. They don't want to hear it. They have been totally immersed in the cultic teaching and are immune to anyone outside trying to reach them, including often their families. So often the deprogramming process involved the process of kidnapping a person and in fact imprisoning them for a period of deprogramming, which was as bad in some cases or worse than the cultic work itself, so that the Cult Awareness Network, seeking to address brainwashing, we first heard of this in Korea and Vietnam with our pilots and other prisoners of war, those who sought to reverse this brainwashing of cultic training began to be much like the cults themselves. This resulted in, guess who? One of the victims and the Church of Scientology suing the Cult Awareness Network. The Cult Awareness Network operated on about a $300,000 a year budget, mainly given by people whose families or whose people had been victimized by cults, and therefore it lived on contributions, and it was a very tightly operated organization. It did not own the programmers, but it referred people to the deprogrammers. So they and the deprogrammers were sued. And the suits were largely paid for by the Church of Scientology. In fact, the Church of Scientology would invite people to lunch and pay them $300 and ask them to sign a blank sheet of paper, and then that would be turned into a lawsuit with their signature. They didn't even know they were involved in a lawsuit against the Cult Awareness Network. It was not pretty. Because the abuse of the deprogramming was so significant, the Cult Awareness Network lost the trial, lost the lawsuits, and was sued millions of dollars between its deprogrammers and the network itself, money it did not have. Now, when someone loses a lawsuit and does not have the money to pay the award of the court to the victims, then their property is sued as far as it is seized, as far as it will go, so that money can be, and sold so that money can be paid to the plaintiffs who had brought the lawsuits. Bottom line is, guess who buys all the cult awareness materials, its machinery, its offices, and its membership list, and its phone numbers, and its addresses? Guess who gets all that? The Church of Scientology. So if you ever gave a contribution to the Cult Awareness Network in the 70s, they got you. And what will they do with it? Well, we get to that in a minute. The bottom line is, Cult Awareness Network went out of existence. Well, it really didn't. It just went under the operation by a slightly differing name. So if you go on the internet looking for the Cult Awareness Network, you will likely bring up something that sounds like it, that's owned and operated by, guess who? The Church of Scientology, a cult. One of the pages they show is Scientology a cult? And that's a very interesting page. It sounds like it's very biased, very balanced, but in curious ways, it's not. Anyway, just some of the history of the 1970s and 1980s surrounding the whole matter of the identification of and dealing with the movement and the reality of cults. The name, as I said, is no longer popular among professional social scientists and others. They want to talk about new religious movements, NRMs. But in fact, new religious movements is not always true. Some of the movements are not new at all. And some of them are not religious at all. So that it doesn't quite cover the network, but it's politically correct, and it doesn't carry a specific bias, and that's what's often used. However, there are some sociologists and some historians and others who say, but we still need a word for cult. So I'm going to use the word this morning, knowing that there will be some that said, you ought to not use the word cult because that's pejorative, and I admit it is, but I don't know how else to define the operation of these organizations. What are some tests for some cults? Well, the first, central authority or a single charismatic leader. As we talk about some of these cults, you'll see how these checklists come into place. Not every cult will fall fully under any one of the 9 categories totally, but there will be a reference in virtually all of them to all of the 9 points. The second is control over life and death. They have the power, so charismatic, they can order the death of someone or order the suicide of someone, as we'll see in 2 cases. Not every one of them does that. commission and conviction of felonies. Most of them have committed felonies. Some of them are run by ex-convicts. 4, polarized worldview. Polarized worldview, our way or the highway, a sense that this is an epic battle for the survival of good, and we are good. Living in communal isolation. It doesn't always mean that they live in a commune, but the result of their cultic activity brings isolation from family, isolation from friends, and in some ways, isolation from communities other than their own. Demand large financial donations. Enforced conformity. In other words, they don't have to all wear uniforms, but they have expected conformity. We'll talk about how this works as we go through these things as well. Significant punishment for defectors or critics. The charismatic leader allows no dissent, allows no questions. So there is a forced conformity and punishment for defectors or critics. The groups are generally small or in small cells, but that's not always true. So those are the 9 tests we might use to say what's cultic. I used the definition and I've footnoted its origin up in the 1, 2, 3, 4th paragraph down. We yet need a word to cult to define those whose qualities include, and now I quote, behavioral and personality changes, loss of personal identity, cessation of scholastic activities, estrangement from families, disinterest in society, and pronounced mental control and enslavement by cult leaders. Some way one needs to have a definition for those kind of activities. Now you say, we're rational people. Does anybody ever do that? Do people ever get caught up in these things? And as they would say in Minnesota, yeah, sure, you betcha. And big time. Some of us, I can look around the room, but I'll not point them out, are too young to remember these things. Second thought, I don't see anybody too young to remember these things. But they're burned in our memories. Look on page 2, the top 3 bullets. How many remember the Charles Manson family of 1967? I found a picture of him under arrest here. You say there are no pictures on my front page. Did you want Charles Manson on the front page of these papers? I didn't. So there's no pictures on the front page of this particular document. The Charles Manson family is something of a hippie. He was something of a hippie and a kind of a floating musician on the fringe of what was a dying hippie movement. He was born to a teenage mother out of wedlock, who was herself at his very young age, for 2 or 3 years old, served a prison term. He was placed with a relative. He in turn, by the time he was a teenager, was first in juvenile detention centers and finally in adult prisons before he started the Manson family. He's an exceedingly savory character. But nonetheless, he was tremendously charismatic, and he began to gather a family, both men and women, but mostly women. They traveled in a hippie-painted school bus, flowers and all that kind of thing. You remember those periods when most of often they were Volkswagen vans, but this was a school bus, and they had ripped all the seats out of it, and they put rugs in it and pillows and everything else, and they lived on the bus as a commune, and they went up and down the West Coast, and he entertained and managed this group by his teachings, quote, and by his singing, quote. He met with a number of Hollywood producers, but none was so moved as to produce him. But this following virtually thought he was something like a guru and a god. And they were incredibly faithful to him. What was he teaching? Well, he had studied Scientology while he was in prison on one of the several terms that he served. And so what he was teaching was a mixture of Scientology and unvarnished Satanism. He had a theme called Helter Skelter. Does anybody remember hearing that phrase? The Beatles sang it. Where else did you hear it?
I lived in Oregon, involved in the whole mess. And so
Then you know that. All right.
I heard and I saw.
It was in blood on the wall in Sharon Tate's home where a series of the murders were taking place, which Charles Manson commanded. At any rate, they were fully under his influence and did what he said, and that included several murders. A number of the Manson clan finally ended up with lifelong prison terms. He was condemned to death, but during the time he was on death row, California dropped the death penalty for a period of time, and he was commuted to life imprisonment without parole. And that was not rescinded when they reestablished the death penalty. So he still lives and is still in prison, and so do some of his followers, some of whom are still serving life sentences as well. Many of his followers continued to communicate with him while he was on death row and after he came off death row, and he's managed this kind of control of these people even while he's convicted, condemned, and in a life sentence. The one that comes to mind from my memory without doing much research is a young lady called Squeaky Fromm. Does anybody remember Squeaky? Squeaky attempted to assassinate President Ford, and then another follower later tried again. Both failed, thank God. But these were followers of Manson. Whether Manson was related to those, I don't recall that was ever proven. Squeaky Fromm now, by the way, has been paroled after serving 35 years, I believe. And her whereabouts are known, but I don't remember now to tell you. She got the name Squeaky. I can't tell you online how she got the name Squeaky, but it had to do with their commune living. Any questions about that? Just to talk about, was it a cult? Absolutely. The cult leader was in direct control of these people. They lived in communal relationships. They gave absolute obedience to him. There was there were murders. There was control over life and death. You can go down the list, and they're all there. Did anybody try to leave the family? Some did, and I don't remember. And some did, obviously, when all the trials were going on. I never heard of them, and they disappeared into the woodwork. But the Charles Manson family becomes cult number one to say how this happened. The date, 1967. In a period of about 34 years, 3 of these will come up and get national media attention. Any questions or comments? This happened. People got caught up in this. Second, the Jonestown Massacre, 1978. How many remember that? James Warren. Well, how about that for drawing a blank after doing Manson's? James Warren Jones started in 1956 the People's Temple Church. He goes through his whole life as the Reverend James Warren Jones, or Jim Jones. He used that title all the way through until his death, and his followers used it. Although his registered faith by the time they were in Jonestown was atheist. More than that, I cannot recall being able to find where or how he was ordained, or by whom. But of course, again, in some fundamentalist traditions, one almost self-ordains. I belong to an organization which is worried about that very issue. And the leader of the organization said, your job is to clean up our act. We need to get rid of these clergy that go into the barn as a farmer and come out as a bishop. Sometimes that happens. I don't know where the title Reverend comes from with Jim Jones, and I have looked. Cannot find in his biographical material. It may be there. I'm not saying it isn't. The People's Temple Church. The People's Temple Church in Indianapolis was beginning in the mid-1950s as an interracial congregation. That was virtual heresy in those days. Therefore, it was not only controversial, it was almost notorious. But after a period of time in Indianapolis, he moved to the West Coast. We had phenomenal success in interracial relationships. He was appointed by the mayor of San Francisco as the chairman of the Interracial Commission of San Francisco. He had public authority and credibility. People's Temple became politically active and was seen as a significant force in the election of the mayor. He had strong political contacts. One of his correspondents and pen pals of sorts was Rosalind Carter. And he met on the campaign plane of Walter Mondale when he was campaigning for president. He had a private meeting of several hours with Walter Mondale. He had tremendous broad range acceptance and support. He doesn't have the criminal record that we talked about with Charles Manson, but he has kind of a floating childhood and adulthood early. He began college. He was appointed by a Methodist bishop as a student pastor of a Methodist congregation. Did not particularly like that. Went back to school, came out with a night school degree in secondary education, and then ended up founding People's Church. There's just kind of a blind spot in the middle. San Francisco media began to investigate some of the charges against People's Temple Church, which included emotional abuse, both adults and children, and other such things. There were also 8 defectors who left with great noise, which the media thoroughly enjoyed. And therefore, by now, being a student of Marx and Lenin and Adolf Hitler and Stalin, he decided that the oppression of capitalism and its institutions and the fear of the United States government made it impossible for him to live comfortably within this culture. So they moved the operation of People's Church to an agricultural experiment in Guyana after some searching through South America, and started what we came to know as Georgetown in 1953 to 55. 500 people went with him into the wilderness, isolated by jungle on every side, into the wilderness to build Jonestown. It was going to be the perfect, beautiful, unpressured, communist community that was the paradise on earth. So was East Berlin, I think I remember. So they went, and what they found, of course, was jungle and hard living and hot and humid climate, very little water, and 11-hour work days to try to build housing for the 500 people, women, children, families, that went with them to the jungles that they would call Jonestown. How does one person get this kind of clout over otherwise intelligent and responsible human beings? I don't know, but they did it. Finally, there were enough complaints from families who worried about their children, who were caught up in this experiment, who wanted to come home but were not allowed to leave. And as a result of that, Representative Congressman Leo Ryan goes down with a team of visitors to visit Jonestown. He is in fact somewhat impressed by what he finds at Jonestown. Everything is on relatively good behavior, although he determines and discovers that there are people who desperately want to get out of here and are not allowed to go. Remember the test of cultism that we mentioned earlier? Can I just talk loud enough to turn this thing off? I will try to shout. My wife shouts at me all the way home to Silver Spring saying, "You turned it off, then you started speaking quietly." So I'll try to shout today. Or she can take a taxi home, one or the other. So Ryan announces while he's there that while he's impressed with the experiment, it's not right that people can't go home if they want to. So he says, anybody who wants to go with me, I will take you out when I leave. Well, there was not much Jim Jones could do about that. This is United States Congressman. He is already terrified that the United States, because these are all United States citizens, will respond to the complaints of abuse, emotional problems, and even sexual abuse that he knows are going back to the States. He is already terrified that the United States will simply invade and take the people home, and so forth. So he has been practicing, practicing revolutionary suicides, when the whole group will drink Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid doesn't want us to use their name, but it was something like Kool-Aid, which is laced with cyanide and Valium. And so they would rehearse this. They'd all line up, they'd drink their little cup of Flavor Aid and supposedly die. And he called this revolutionary suicide, and he said, the day will come when we'll have to do that because we will be attacked. They'll not allow us to have this glorious freedom that we have. Clearly now, not all people think it's glorious. Not all people are experiencing it as freedom. Many people are terrified. He was known to, over the loudspeaker in the camp, lecture all night long. You had to learn to sleep under his lecturing all night long over a loudspeaker when he indoctrinated the residents of this paradisal kind of community. So, at any rate, when Jim Jones prepares to leave, he says, everybody going with me, queue up. So a group did, not many, because many of them were afraid of people they left behind and what would happen to them. So even though there were others that wanted to go, they were afraid even to go with the United States congressman. So they finally all jumped aboard a truck and they went to the airfield there, and there were supposed to be 2 planes waiting for them. The planes weren't there. And while they waited for the planes, another truck drove up with members of Jonestown's security squad aboard the truck, and these people were machine gunned down. Among others, the congressman is killed as well, assassinated. He is the only United States congressman, senator, or representative ever to this day to die while on duty. It was his daughter then that, as a result of this, as we mentioned earlier, started the Cult Awareness Network in response to her father's assassination by a cult. Jim Jones was then frantic, panicked. He decided any moment, he told them any moment the paratroopers are going to come from the skies, they're going to shoot us and torture our babies and all this kind of stuff. While some tried to object, according to the eyewitnesses, you say, if everybody committed suicide, how were there any eyewitnesses? Well, you've got all but 1,000 people here. Even though you've got armed guards in the periphery of the camp, they got to line up too. So some people were successful, not many, in sneaking off into the jungle, some with their babies. And also, there were tapes, and the FBI discovered the tapes and the written materials and so forth. So the stories come out even from the dead. The picture you have here on page 2 shows the dead strewn about the pavilion. They died within 5 minutes of drinking the cyanide. Had Jim Jones been planning this for a long time? Absolutely. Where did he get the cyanide? It's a controlled substance. Well, he got a ½ pound of cyanide every month for the entire time they were there because he got himself licensed as a jeweler in Guyana. And as a jeweler, you use cyanide to clean gold. So he had a legitimate reason for cyanide, and he's been stocking up these ½ pound shipments for about 2 years of cyanide. So that all of this was somewhat laid out by the charismatic leader of this group. So as a result of that, 900, and I've got it here, 918 people died, including 276 children. The children were fed the cyanide by a syringe stuck in their mouths and injected. People generally died within 5 minutes. They were told they would die within 15 minutes. Many of them left their bank accounts, such as they had, in wills to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to carry on the work that Jonestown had begun. So, once again, what started as People's Church, Temple Church in Indianapolis, harmless enough, turns out to be the Jonestown suicide/massacre. There's evidence that some were forced to commit suicide. Investigations of the dead, which of course were done by Guyana authorities and also the FBI and ATF, has been an unfolding story for a number of years. Cult number 2. Any questions? There are cults that are destructive, sometimes to your person, sometimes otherwise. Let me come to the back because I've got to hear the question and repeat it, Arlene.
So the community down in Jonestown existed for 2 years?
I'm sorry?
The community existed for 2 years in Jonestown?
1953 to 55 was its building, and 55 to, what did I say, 78.
Oh, okay. So the population then increased by about 400 over that time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
The question was, how long did the community last after it was built? They started and set the agreements in 53, went there in 55, and of course the Jonestown massacre was 1978. So that period of time. Yes, there were new people there, and those people were somewhat international in origin. In fact, the list of the dead is on the internet. Lee?
How many survived? Did they survive at all?
You know, I can't say it was less than a dozen. Question was, how many survived? And it was the few that could go into the jungle and then survive there until help came. So, some actually got out on one of the planes, but not the congressman, and I don't know how many finally boarded the plane. I'm sorry, I have read it, I don't have active recall now. The planes were small planes, this was the grass airstrip. You didn't put in a C-40, for example. Other questions? All right, cult 3. This is the Branch Davidians. Who in the world are the Branch Davidians? Well, the Branch Davidians are a branch of the branch of the branch. The Branch Davidians were an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but they were an offshoot of a group that had left the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1935. They were actually, to use the Adventist term, disfellowshipped. They were disfellowshipped, expelled from the SDA for aberrant teachings. And then the Branch Davidians with which we deal from Waco, Texas, are an offshoot of that group who split away in about 1955. Their doctrine is essentially Seventh-day Adventist doctrine, except they had an interesting spin-off, with some strong similarities to Messianic Judaism, and the idea of the branch. David is the branch. Jesus was sometimes talked about as the branch. The Davidians go back to King David. So they are Branch Davidians They are somewhat also Seventh-day Adventist, and with a heavy tinge of Messianic Judaism. They tended to be very extreme. They tended to be very prophetic. They tended to be people who waited actively for the last times. You had to be a prophet, recognized by the group as a prophet in order to be their leader. You had to demonstrate some prophetic skill. It was not uncommon for them to have their prophet announce a last day, a coming of Christ, a day of judgment, whatever you might call it. And some people were indeed known to sell their possessions and build a space on the compound of Mount Carmel Center outside of Waco, Texas. Some just tented there awaiting for that great day. But of course, the days never came. And usually with that, the prophet fell as well as the day. The prophet who predicted the day, when the day came and nothing happened, didn't often last very long after that. But it was a very tightly knit, very internally disciplined, cultic kind of group. David Koresh, who was the leader when we had the confrontation with the ATF and the FBI and the Texas state authorities, had only been leading them for a couple of years, and he was also an ex-convict, had also been expelled for moral causes from the SDA and from the original branch group that split in 1935. So Koresh was, in fact, a no man's person when he arrived at the Branch Davidians. His name was not Koresh, but Vernon Wayne Howell, Howell. But in 1990, he petitioned the federal court in California to allow him to change his name for business and personal reasons, and they did, in fact, allow him to do so. And the name he chose was David Koresh. David, hacking back to whom? King David, absolutely, King David. And Koresh is an alliteration of the Persian pronunciation of Cyrus. Who was Cyrus? Cyrus was the Persian king who allowed the Jewish exiles to go back home after the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE. So he relates himself to Cyrus as the deliverer, and David, the man from whom the Messiah will come. Are you following the rationale of that? Shoots his way into the Branch Davidian compound at Mount Carmel and becomes its leader. There's a lot of intrigue. I'm oversimplifying it. It's even suggested by rumor, but the Branch Davidians are thought to have covered it up, that he had a sexual affair with their then leader, a 77-year-old lady. And he was only 33 when the place burned down. Shortly after he took over by gunpoint, he announces that God has given him a vision. And the vision is, I see some of you looking like saying, I don't believe this. I can see it on your faces. I'm yet to tell you the story. After he establishes himself as the leader of the Branch Davidians, he has a vision from God saying that he must propagate with the women of the compound so as to start a new house of David. It gets better. So all the men give up their wives, they move over, and the men live in one segregated part, and all the women go live in another segregated part and begin to procreate with David Koresh. There's no evidence in anything I can read that there was anybody that said, oh no way, I'm out of here. Not the women, not the men who gave up their wives. Do you understand why you get scared of cults? Has anybody got the message yet? But it isn't too long after that, not long enough for the house of David to be born and begin to have a progeny, that the assertions that there was abuse of children, even sexual abuse of children, rose. Janet Reno said, as Attorney General during the Bill Clinton administration, Janet Reno says that she had claims of child abuse and child sexual abuse, which was the reason, in part, the FBI was there. The FBI said, we never saw those charges, so who knows? But there were also charges that there were illegal guns and weapons there. Koresh bragged before the showdown that he was better armed than a whole platoon in Vietnam. And they had, among other things, AK-47s, the Russian-produced guns. And so that gets the attention of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, ATF. So the ATF and the FBI go with a search warrant they've gotten from a local judge in Texas to search the Branch Davidian compound to see whether this is true and to confiscate, if it's true, these things. Supposedly the FBI is there. Of course, these are federal laws too. The FBI is there both for federal laws and for the child abuse charges that have been surfacing. When they get to the Branch Davidian compound, they are met by armed guards of the Branch Davidians, all with automatic guns. Translate AK-47s and similar. There is a shootout. 4 ATF agents are killed. 6 Branch Davidians are killed. What follows is a 51-day standoff. During that standoff, the authorities, Texas and federal, say if anybody wants to leave, it would be a good thing to leave now. And maybe it would be a good thing if everybody comes out peacefully. Some did. Unfortunately, then the ATF and the FBI said they were involved in the shootout. They killed 4 of our agents, so those who risked coming out were promptly arrested and thrown in jail. Not the women and children, but the men. Probably not the smartest way to have handled the situation at that point, but nonetheless. There were attempts to negotiate with Koresh. Some days he was willing to negotiate. Some days he didn't seem to be. And then they decided 51 days is enough. We're going in, and they fired tear gas canisters into the compound, thinking that will force the people to evacuate. Instead, apparently, and nobody knows for sure whether there's evidence to both sides, and the arguments still rage. Did the Branch Davidians light the place and fire it and burn it down? Or did the tear gas canisters ignite loose gas or other things in the compound? There are both sides. The bomber of Oklahoma's federal building claimed that was in response to the attack on the Branch Davidians. So, this kind of thing has legs. At any rate, the end result is that 55 died, and 55 adults and 28 children are found dead in the compound after the fire. Some have been shot. Nobody knows whether they were executed or committed suicide. It just continues to rage, and San Diego University has been studying the issue for years, so have others. The matter is essentially over. Questions? Why did they stay inside? Well, some have conjectured, and it's probably true, that this was interpreted by Koresh as the doomsday that they'd all been expecting. This was the coming. This was the great and terrible day which had been prophesied within their group. So some stayed to welcome the day. All died who stayed inside. Others have said they shouldn't have, there was no need for the military to use force. All kinds of second guessing. But what's just frightening is one human being has total allegiance and total mind control and the gift of life and death in his, or it could have been her, hands. Questions? Yes?
One question. Is it known as to how many were in the compound before everything happened, before the first killing?
The question is, does anyone know how many were in the compound before the burn down? I'm sure there is that number. I did not research carefully enough how many actually came out, not many, and many of those were in prison for a while, and some for a long while. And then there were women and children. I've not seen a count of that, but I'm sure it exists. And it would be that number plus whatever else came out. Yes?
Just recently, and I can't remember if it was in the Washington Post, and I wondered if you'd seen it there, and I think it was probably the Washington Post with a op-ed kind of letter, and I don't know if it was one of the children or one of the people who was put in prison afterwards talking about it, and the very thing you were saying about speculating, was the United States actually suppressing a religious movement? But I was surprised to see it brought up again.
Well, Timothy McVeigh thought they were.
That there's still a group of some number of people.
Yeah, there are still Branch Davidians. They have a Sunday morning service that's attended on the average by about a half a dozen people. That's 6. There are thought to be about 20 living in the immediate environments of the Mount Carmel Center, and maybe a few more scattered elsewhere. Again, the names of those who died are interestingly quite international and are listed on the internet as well. Question back here? Okay, we can move on, and our time is almost up, so maybe I just forget Scientology. I've stuck Al-Qaeda in here, not because I thought it needed explanation, only mention. So there's 6 lines about it here, but how it fits that thing of cults, it is a fanatic religious cult for which people are willing to die and for whom the commanders can command death, can select for self-suicide. Let me move on then a bit about the Church of Scientology. It's been identified as a cult by many sources. It was one of the first lifted up by Cult Awareness back in the 70s. After a very long legal battle, I want to say almost 30 years, they won the battle in the United States courts to be recognized as a tax-exempt religious organization. So IRS recognizes them as a tax-exempt religious organization, and it's received similar recognition in Austria, Portugal, Spain, Slovenia, Sweden, Croatia, Hungary, and Kazakhstan, and recently in New Zealand as a charitable organization, but not religious. It has not received recognition in Canada, the UK, Germany, Belgium, and France. France actually calls it a cult. The same is true for Ireland, Luxembourg, Israel, and Mexico. In Germany, it is under investigation for criminal anti-constitutional activities and has been so for more than a decade. So it has its problems. My acid test for somebody that uses the cross and the title church for its operation, the first question is, what do they say about Jesus? And let me actually read it. To quote L. Ron Hubbard exactly, and these are his words, the concept of Jesus as God is a fiction that ought to be renewed removed by auditing. What is auditing? You get into the Church of Scientology by a private, confidential, long interview of directed questions called auditing. The interviewer only listens but directs the questions. There's also an e-meter that they use, which has been declared by FDA and a whole bunch of other people as totally a fraud device. But it's supposed to recognize electronic impulses to show how, to the questions, you have a response that the auditor should follow with more specific questions. Recordings and written records are kept forever of your auditing session in what's called a pre-clear file. Auditing is to clear you from all the baggage of prejudices which you have received from generations before you. So in auditing, you're supposed to clear your mind and free you to be an individual so that you can flourish in full and happiness individualism. It sounds great. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology, also said in a 1955 lecture, and I quote L. Ron Hubbard, now dead, died in the late 1980s, "And among the people who hand it to us," which is spiritual wisdom, which he talked about earlier, "was a man named Moses. And again it was handed on to a man named Christ. And he handed it on to the Arab nations, and the Arab nations benefited from this through their own prophet Muhammad," quote unquote. Notice he gives Muhammad the status of prophet, doesn't give any status to Jesus or to Moses. And of course he calls Jesus Christ, which is a faith term. His name, my friend Hubbard, was Jesus. Christ is a faith statement. I mean, the ignorance of what he's writing about is phenomenal. Nonetheless, there are preserved in the archives of Scientology 500,000 pages of the writings of L. Ron Hubbard. He wrote all the creeds, all the books of discipline, all the orders of Scientology, and it has now been stated that only the unaltered, proven to be original writings of Hubbard are official in this church. Secondary interpretations are strictly forbidden. Now, unpack that for just a moment. Secondary interpretations would be something like you're saying, well, the way I see it is forbidden. Now, on the Cult Awareness Network, by a slightly different name, they say, is the Church of Scientology, they don't mention ownership of that network, is the Church of Scientology a cult? Well, the first thing of a cult, it has to have a charismatic leader. Well, nobody can claim their current president is charismatic. He's almost reclusive. That's true. And Hubbard is dead. And how can you have a dead, charismatic leader? Obviously, it fails on that judgment, says their cult site. But the point is, they have deified every letter of L. Ron Hubbard's writings, and nothing can be changed. There are 500,000 pages, 8,500 lectures, recorded lectures, and 47 films by this fellow. All of which is now the ultimate, final, unchangeable word. There are not even many Christians who say that about Scripture. We always know that there are varying translations and there are varying interpretations, and I say to you all the time, well, some say this, some say this. You don't play that game in Scientology. You are taught by a leader who's continually being audited, not in the front, but watched. You pay for your degrees in the church. It's about $200, maybe $250 now, to be audited. The highest degrees, which only a few people ever bother to attain, cost the person, the candidate, in excess of $20,000. It's only in the upper levels of revelation that you get the comments about Jesus. So in the meantime, you're permitted to use the cross, which culture understands as to be the cross of Jesus. You're kind of permitted to call yourself the church, but somebody's got to pay $20,000 to hear you tell you the absence of Jesus, the absence of church, and those kinds of things. So there is, even though he's dead, a central charismatic leader. Now, if you are critical, or if I join the order and Doris is critical, or more likely, Doris joins the order and goes, I come unglued! I will be identified publicly as a RP, a repressive person. No one in the order is allowed to have any relationship whatsoever with me as a published, identified RP. And if you do, you are expelled from the order. Now, I wouldn't want to say that's mind control, but nothing critical can get inside the circle. Do you follow what I mean? That's scary stuff. Big Hollywood names have bought into this. It has been listed as the cause for some big Hollywood divorces. Of course, it doesn't take much in Hollywood to get a divorce, but nonetheless, some pretty big names of people a lot of us like have blamed Scientology for the destruction of their marriage. It would be no surprise when it cost $20,000 to get into the higher echelons of revelation that they owned their own cruise ship. It's a remarkable, remarkable undertaking. And I've said what I wanted to say earlier, so you can draw your own conclusions from anything you remember. I see Penny standing in the back. I see the hands on the clock moving to 11:30, and it's time to quit. Thank you all very much, and I'll talk to whoever wants to talk afterward, but we're done for today. Thank you. Next week, the 3 Abrahamic faiths. By the way, you guys are driving me crazy to get prepared. This is hard work.
David.